Back?
Yep.
Yeah.
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Okay. So I don't need to like test at the beginning.
Test, test.
Perfect.
Test. Perfect. Test, test. Test. Test, test.
Good evening. Welcome. You found us. You found Waterloo if you had to find Waterloo. You found our brand new academic center. And this is known as the Van Stone Lecture Hall. So I was saying to a couple people today that these lectures have started back in 1982. And is it right, Doug, that we were in that location since 1982? Right. So it's a big deal to move to a new space, but a great space. So welcome. Glad that you could be here. Welcome to the 2016-2017 Lectures in Catholic Experience. And I want to extend a special welcome to any of you who are here at St. Jerome's University for the first time, or maybe for the first time at a lecture, and we're very happy that you could be with us this evening. I want to begin the evening by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land that was promised to the Six Nations and includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. My name is Christina Vanine, and I'm Associate Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and I coordinate this lecture series. And I just want to check before we get started with the evening that you have in fact turned off any electronic devices that you might have with you. This is great. I get to see faces this one. This is great. In the homily at the opening Mass for the Synod on the Family, Pope Francis had this to say about our current global situation. Today we experience the paradox of a globalized world filled with luxurious mansions and skyscrapers, but a lessening of the warmth of homes and families. Many ambitious plans and projects, but little time to enjoy them. Many pleasures, but few loves. Many liberties, but little freedom. The drama of solitude is experienced by countless men and women. He says, I think of the elderly, abandoned even by their loved ones and children, widows and widowers, the many men and women left by their spouses, all those who feel alone, misunderstood, unheard, migrants and refugees fleeing from war and persecution, and those many young people who are victims of a culture of consumerism, a culture of waste, a throwaway culture. The church, he said, is called to carry out its mission in charity, not by pointing a finger in judgment of others, but rather conscious of its duty to seek out and care for hurting couples with the balm of acceptance and mercy. To be, quote unquote, a field hospital with doors wide open to whoever knocks in search of help and support. To reach out to others with true love, to walk with our fellow men and women who suffer. We are called to be a church which teaches authentic love. This evening, we're fortunate to have with us Dr. Julie Hanlon Rubio, who is Professor of Christian Ethics at St. Louis University, to help us think a bit about Pope Francis's vision for families and for a church that meets people where they are and welcomes all. Dr. Rubio's interdisciplinary research brings the resources of Catholic social thought, social science, and feminist theory to ethical analyses of marriage, family, sex, and gender. Currently, she serves on the boards of the National Catholic Reporter and the National Seminar on Jesuit Higher Education. She's the author of 3 books, A Christian Theology of Marriage and Family, published by Paulist Press, Family Ethics, Practices for Christians, published by Georgetown Press, Hope for Common Ground, Mediating the Personal and Political in a Divided Church, which is just out this year. And in 2017, her guide to Pope Francis's recent document on family will be published by the Liturgical Press with the title, Reading, Praying, and Living Pope Francis's The Joy of Love. Dr. Rubio holds a BA in Political Science from Yale University, an MTS from Harvard Divinity School, and a PhD in Religion and Social Ethics from the University of Southern California. She teaches courses in Christian ethics, social justice, social ethics and family ethics, and politics. In 2016, she received the Excellence in Teaching Award from the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. She regularly gives talks and presentations and workshops on political questions, social justice, spiritual practices of love and solidarity, and certainly in the last couple of years, Pope Francis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Hanlon Rubio to speak to us on the topic, Families, Love, and Justice, the Vision of Pope Francis. Dr.
Thanks, Christina, and thanks to all of you for having me here. I have really loved my day here. I got to talk to a class of students this afternoon, and we had a lovely dinner, and I've had Smarties for the first time. So I think I'm hooked. I like them. So thanks Waterloo, right? So what I want to talk about today is love and justice. And my sense throughout my career has been that there are two different audiences in society as well as in the church. There's an audience that would more likely come to hear about love and family, and an audience that would more likely come to hear about justice. There are Christians who consider themselves more family values kinds of people, and Christians who consider themselves more social justice people. They end up on different parish committees, sometimes in different parishes. I see your heads nodding. Yes, this happens here too, right? Not just in my context. Yeah, it happens in campus ministry. And it happens in secular culture as well. We feel ourselves drawn to these different poles. We have different ideas in politics about where the real problems in society lie. Is it the problem of broken families and values, or is it the problem of government and racism and incarceration and immigration and all of those kinds of things? But I think Pope Francis bridges that divide, and I think Catholic social thought bridges that divide. And it's a divide that I've tried to bridge in my own work as well. So I want to present that story to you, the story of a pope who is a social justice pope who nonetheless really cares deeply about family, but talks about family in a way that is more broadly appealing, so that I think he has a better shot of being heard. But even in talking about it, he's coming from the tradition, but he's also taking us forward in the tradition. So I'll do this in three parts. I'll talk about his social justice cred. I'll talk about the synod on the family that he called, why he did that, and why the process of the synod matters so much for the kind of synthesis he's trying to make. And then I'll talk about his document, The Joy of Love, which I think is the longest papal document ever. I don't know how many of you have made it through it. I had to read it the afternoon it came out, locked myself in my office, canceled office hours, and made it all the way through. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. So we'll talk about how he connects faith and justice and all the, love and justice in profound ways in each of those areas. So first, why do I call him the social justice pope? Some theologians have said he is remarkably on message, Pope Francis. Almost every time he's speaking, he's talking about recentering the Christian faith on Jesus, on justice, on the poor. He does this not only in what he says, but in what he writes and in how he is, right? The personal lifestyle choices he's made to not have some of the finery that comes with being a pope, and the ways in which he always is going to the margins, the phrase associated with him. And I know I'm lucky to have a colleague who has traveled with the Pope on almost every papal trip. And he says in every single place, it's not just one time, but it's multiple places where the Pope is going to talk to people on the margins. Right? This is remarkable. Along with this, and this is a more complicated point, He is a social justice pope because he is operating with a different way of moral reasoning. Sometimes we talk about in the Catholic tradition that social thought, when we talk about social issues, it seems to be more open, more developmental, more open to different voices, and a place where we might expect people in the church to disagree. You don't have to have the exact same opinion about how to combat poverty. That's okay. Whereas when we talk about issues related to sex and gender and family, we tend to have a more rigid ethical method, less room for diversity and less room for development. What the Pope has done is made our moral reasoning unified. And the moral reasoning that he lays out, which is open and listening and humble and expecting of some diversity, is one he applies not just to social ethics issues, but also to family ethics issues. And that's a really important move. So let me show you some of that and what he's written. So some of you may have heard about Laudato Si, his major encyclical on the environment. And of course, a big part of that encyclical is how he asks us to expand our notion of justice to include the earth and the creatures of the earth. So he says that we have been excessively anthropocentric, right, focused on human beings, and we haven't thought enough about the earth or its creatures. So that means that some of our social teaching needs to be updated. And even the way we've talked about the biblical text in Genesis, by focusing on the word dominion in Genesis, is going to have to be corrected essentially with more of a focus on responsible stewardship of the earth. One of my friends who's an ecclesiologist says, I think the catechism is going to need to be updated now because he has moved us along, right? So he's pulling us to the center. He's recentering Christian faith on justice and also expanding our notions of that, developing, moving us forward. In his document, Evangelii Gaudium, he brought social concern to moral theology. So in talking about very basic ideas about how to be a moral person, he kept talking about poverty. He kept talking about concern for those who are left out. He said, before all else, the gospel invites us to respond to the God of love who saves us, to see God in others, and to go forth from ourselves to seek the good of others. That's the core. Right? And then what that meant is there was going to be a little less emphasis on certain issues that people were used to hearing a lot from the church about. So he's moving the center there. He defined poverty as a life issue. He says poverty kills. Have to remember that. Poverty kills. So we have to say, thou shalt not, he says, to an economy of inequality and exclusion. This recentering, right, is fundamentally important. And so is his ability to say, we focus on where people are hurting. And if our theology is insufficient, we acknowledge that and we try to move forward. Now, it would seem then that maybe we should have a synod on poverty, on global poverty, right, or the environment. But that's not what he did. But I think it was a brilliant call to have this synod on marriage and family. Now, my friends say, of course you think it's brilliant, Julie. That's what you've been studying for all these years. But really, it's not just that. This is a tool that hasn't been used much since it was defined at the end of the Second Vatican Council, but it's a tool that gives the Pope the ability to call the bishops of the world together and consult with them. And I think Pope Francis knew that if he wants to heal the church, if he wants to extend mercy to people, marriage and family is where people feel like they need mercy, where they need healing. So that's where he needed to begin. And he needed to show that even there, the church could be a listening church, a humble church, a developing church. And I think that's what we saw at the synod. So one thing that's really important about the synod is that the bishops tried to listen. So before they all went to Rome and started fighting with each other, which is what they did, right? They sent out surveys, right? And one might think, well, why do you need a survey? We all know what Catholic teaching is on these questions. Why do you need to ask people what they think about it? But in fact, the Vatican directed bishops to, in some way, find out what people thought about it. And they did not all do it the same way, but in many dioceses throughout the world, people were asked for their opinions. This was really important. All of those surveys made their way some way to Rome. And it was very clear that the committees among the bishops and their staffs read these surveys. And then when they wrote early preparatory documents for the synod, they told us what was in those surveys. And they told us, honestly, things like there's a lot of what theologians call non-reception out there. That means teachings are promulgated, but they're not received. Sometimes people know what they are, but they don't know why they are what they are. And sometimes they don't understand the basis for them, or they just don't agree with them, or they don't feel like they can live them out even if they wanted to. And that's what these bishops acknowledged in their documents that they took with them to the synod. They acknowledged that there was diversity of opinion about things like gender, whether it's possible to keep a lifelong marriage vow, polygamy, same-sex union, cohabitation, contraception, all of those things. So all of a sudden, it was out on the table. We were not pretending that all Catholics thought all the same things all the time. So they listened. That seems to me is really important if you want to treat people in the church with justice, which is an essential step of calling them then to practice justice. What else did they do at the synod? Well, they said, like Francis has always said, let's focus on the essentials. They tried to focus on the essentials. So instead of focusing on very specific rules and controversial things, they tried to talk just about marriage and why it matters. And they tried to use language people could actually understand. They said, we get it. The whole natural law stuff that we've been talking, it just doesn't resonate with people. We write about marriage and they don't recognize their own marriages in the language of our documents. One quote from some of the final document that came out of the synod is, about marriage is, in the liberty of the yes exchanged by the man and woman for their whole lives, the love of God is made present and is experienced. It's the yes. Or this on parenting. In their union and love, spouses experience the beauty of paternity and maternity. They share plans and fatigue. I've never seen that in a Catholic document. Plans and fatigue. Desire and preoccupation. They learn to take care of each other and to forgive each other. Or families where we learn to live with each other despite our differences and to belong. This is a big step for them to hear what people actually value and experience in their marriage and family and try to communicate that in essential ways. Pope Francis also took his signature mercy to the synod, and he keeps saying we need to offer mercy before judgment. Right? It doesn't mean he doesn't make judgments. I know he's known for being non-judgmental, for saying, who am I to judge? I actually think Francis is judging all the time. Right? That's because he's a prophet. I mean, right? He's always telling us what we're doing wrong. But he manages to do that because he offers mercy first. Essential. So mercy, talking about what does keep people away from church. What might be good in cohabiting relationships, even if they aren't all that we would want. Is there a way in which people are moving toward the ideal that we hold up? He also took a signature part word that I have never seen in any teaching on sex or family, but only in social thought, which is accompaniment. That's a word I know from social justice circles, right? Not moral theology, but there it is. It was there from the very first interviews that Pope Francis gave. And he means by that to keep company with, to walk with, not to try to solve people's problems right away or preach at them, but to listen, to suffer with. So if we can do that when we go on service trips or when we're working with people who are suffering, this is what the church also wants to do with people who are wounded in their marital and family lives. The Synod Father said, the church wants to be a light for the wounded, for those in the midst of the storm. Finally, one of the most important things that came out of the decision of the Synod, I think, is that we knew that the Synod Fathers disagreed, but that Pope Francis told them, keep talking, and kicked no one out. Again, often on marriage and family, that's not what we hear. Often people aren't allowed to voice disagreement. Often they are told to leave the room, but not in the Synod. Everybody was there. And that meant the conservatives too. Some of the liberals were like, well, aren't you more on our side? Shouldn't you kick out? No, everybody stays. Right? And everybody talks. And they don't make a document that they can't all agree on. And Francis actually said in his final speech at the Synod, it would have been really disappointing not to have debate like this. I love that, right? So important to know that the Pope says, yeah, we're going to have debate on these questions. That's what it means to be church. So here we have in the Synod listening, dialogue, an emphasis on humility, an emphasis on the essentials, mercy, disagreement, and diversity. But the Synod itself actually doesn't have very much power. It can have all the documents it wants, but those documents don't actually have a ton of authority, right? It's an advisory kind of meeting. So we didn't know, once the Synod happened, what was going to happen next. It wasn't clear. But then, fairly soon after, Francis decided to write his own document, The Joy of Love. And there, he connected marriage and social justice, bringing both in substance and in method in really profound ways. Now, I'm not telling you the whole thing is amazing reading, but definitely parts of it. The first thing to say, though, is that the Pope is not making this up. That is, the connection between family and social justice is not something that is completely new. I think that's important to say. Sometimes there's a tendency on the left to want to say Pope Francis is our guy, and John Paul II and Benedict, they just didn't get it. You know, some ways that's true. But really, Pope Benedict and John Paul II had all kinds of beautiful social documents as well, and they also talked about the social role of the family. So Pope Francis was able to draw upon, in fact, he consciously drew upon previous popes to root his teaching in their teaching. So that's kind of what popes do, to show I'm staying within the tradition even though I'm pulling it along. So he was able to draw on important phrases like the family is the first cell of society. It's the school of deeper humanity. Or the family has a social mission. Or as John Paul II said, far from being closed in on itself, the family is by nature and vocation open to other families in society. And that's why it undertakes a social role. When you think about rhetoric in our culture about family as a refuge, as a safe haven, as a place to retreat from the world, even read real estate ads, right? Your master bedroom is your retreat. It's like a spa, it's like a hotel, right? Think of all that retreat language, right? right? John Paul II is saying no, right? It's all about being open. So Pope Francis had all that to build upon, but then he took it further. So one thing he did is something that is really typical, more typical in our social justice documents. He started by doing what Gaudium et Spes called reading the signs of the times. So usually when we do marriage and family teaching, we tend to start with, here's what we've always said, and here's how it still applies. We'll say it a little nicer, right? But that's kind of the method. Here he starts with that more social ethics method and says, let's read the sign of the times. But he also didn't turn around and say, everything's awful, no one respects family anymore, it's all ridiculous, right? He didn't want to say that either. He actually starts as a sign of the time with the experience of love and joy that people know in their families. Let's start there. He wants to acknowledge that even those whose families are imperfect experience that joy and deep relationship often, not always. And then he turned to the things that he saw as problematic. And he talked about things that we might expect him to talk about cohabitation, about single parenthood, lone parenthood, divorce. But he also talked about other things that are consistent themes in his speaking, about loneliness and alienation, restlessness that prevents us from keeping commitments, individualism, and a romanticism that suggests to us that we're going to find the one perfect person that is going to meet every need and fulfill everything, that he thinks is really destructive. He also talked about social phenomenon that shape the ability of people to keep marriage vows. So instead of keeping marriage and family over here, and migration and poverty and trafficking and incarceration over here, he said, these things are totally linked, right? When people are incarcerated, it's hard to keep families together. When people are migrating for work, it breaks up families. And so these are things that make it hard for people, and we have to recognize them as part of the social context. It's not just that people don't have family values anymore, although he would acknowledge some of that when he talks about individualism, romanticism, right? But there's also a social context out there that's making it really hard. In the US, we talk about two marriage cultures. I don't know if you have a similar language here. That is, the people who tend to have more privilege and more education are following the traditional marriage script, actually, even if they might have more liberal views. It's the people who have less education and less privilege who are marrying less, cohabiting more, divorcing more, and really feeling the wounds of that in their context. So marriage brings with it, marriage exacerbates privilege, and living outside of that can exacerbate lack of privilege. And so there are graphs that just keep going like this that sociologists tell us about. So he acknowledged some of that social context. And so he says, in that context, I want to speak into that context. I want to offer some wisdom from the tradition. But he also said, I'm not going to answer all the questions. Another thing we don't tend to have in marriage and family, on marriage and family, right? I'm not going to give you everything. Some priests have come to me now frustrated. Like, why didn't he just lay down a new rule about divorced people, divorced or remarried people in communion like we wanted to? I needed an answer. Because that's not the kind of pope he wants to be. We'll talk about the particulars of that in Q&A if you want. But that wasn't the main point. It was, I know in the news coverage that maybe if you followed it, that seemed to be the main point. There are a lot of other points that are more fundamental, and he didn't want to lay down rules. He remembered in this document of his, the synod, as this vibrant process full of debate and disagreement, and in doing so, legitimated that. And so that's our process. That's who we are as church. So now in that context, he says, let me give you some wisdom. And then, in another move that I think is really unique, he speaks, this is in section 4 in the document where some people say you should start. He speaks directly to couples in language that is not made for people like me, not made for theologians. It's made for me as a partner, as a spouse, but not as a theologian so much. Very down to earth. And he speaks with respect. And he starts out by admitting flaws in the church's teaching, too much focus on procreation, lofty ideals, and a lack of, without like grounding it in experience, and a lack of respect for conscience. One of the most famous lines from the document now is, we've been called to form consciences, not replace them. So he wants to form, but not to replace people's own discernment. So he starts there. Now I'm listening, right? Right? When you start with self-criticism and an admission that you don't have all the answers, then people are more willing to listen. Then he shares the wisdom, and he knows that the question he needs to answer is, why get married? In many parts of the world, yes. In the US, actually, although people are getting married, we're still pretty positive about marriage, but in a lot of parts of the world, not so much. And certainly the question of why stay married, or why marriage matters, why it's worth it to stay and love for a lifetime. Those are questions that we haven't done a great job of answering. And so he starts to talk then about marriage as friendship. Much more helpful, I think. Probably the way people experience it a little bit more. As intimacy, as warmth, stability, shared life. Very down-to-earth language. He has to talk about indissolubility, or the Catholic idea that marriage, it's not that marriage that you shouldn't get divorced, but that you can't. Marriage is indissoluble. It's a very difficult and controversial theological concept, and there are exceptions, right, of a kind. But he wants to talk about that not as a rule that you must obey. It is that way, therefore you can't violate it. But more as something that, an ideal that makes sense, that you want to live into. So he spends a lot of time talking about how it's not going to be always awesome, right? He says love doesn't have to be perfect for us to value it. Even when the other person is not loving us well, when they're loving us the best they can with all their limits, then love is still real. Now, he makes a distinction here. Like, sometimes people aren't loving you. Sometimes people are not treating you with sufficient dignity, and there is a time then where you have to depart. Right? People deserve respect. But when people are loving you imperfectly, that's normal. Right? So he says, we love people even when they're infirm and elderly, unattractive. This word appears several times. I don't know why, right? And he realizes in some really poignant passages that sometimes in marriage, people feel unseen and unappreciated. So he says, love opens our eyes and enables us to see beyond all else the great worth of a human being. That's social justice, in a sense. It's the dignity of every human person, despite who they are, despite their age, right, their illness, their attractiveness, any of that, the worth of a human being. He tries to call couples to growth. Marriage is not this static thing, right? He says you need to cultivate intimacy, joy, spends a long time talking about good communication, in which he says, and by the way, if you're going to have good communication, you need to have something to say. Don't be boring. Right? Accept, over and over again, accept imperfection. That's part of marriage. And one might say that in accepting imperfection and learning to love through that, you're preparing yourself to love beyond the bonds of family as well. Now, it's not all imperfection. He also has some lovely passages on the Song of Songs that other popes have not wanted to touch, talks about sexual passion in marriage. In fact, I wrote about that a little bit for the Washington Post in a blog piece, and they, of course, took my first paragraph and totally changed it, and the headline just becomes, Pope Francis, the sexy pope. And I'm like, no, right? No. But there is some of it there. There's some of it there. There are also some beautiful passages from Martin Luther King in a document on Catholic marriage and family, right, who the Pope also raised up in a speech to Congress as a great American. And what he takes from King is love of enemies and the need for forgiveness. And of course, King said, you have to love your enemy not because they're right. You offer forgiveness even when it's undeserved, right? Because you know that the person is always more than the worst thing that they have done. That he wants to apply to marriage. So instead of just saying, stay married, he really narrates the day-to-day process of being in a loving relationship, encouraging, really appreciating, contemplating, growing in your love and growing into marriage through life, into this experience of belonging completely to another person. So then fidelity becomes not this burden, not this thing that you have to do because you're Catholic, but rather this thing that this ideal that you're aspiring to. Mimicking, he says, mimicking God, who is always close and never abandons us. So, of course, he knows that not everybody is going to be able to achieve this ideal. There's some worry in the theological community about whether he talked too much about ideals and then what we do when people don't meet the ideals. We can also talk about that if you would like. But he knows that so much. And so then he uses this term, accompaniment, to talk about how we deal with it when people aren't able to keep to that ideal that we still hold up in such high esteem. So in the sections that are directed to pastors, there he's saying, you need to figure out ways, because I'm not going to give you all the answers. There's no blueprint. You need to figure out the ways to walk with people who are wounded in their marriages and their families. So figure it out, right? Figure out the premarital preparation. Figure out how do you form people into the kind of people who can stay married to people who aren't perfect, right? How do you do that? Right? That's a lot of virtue formation. He says our moral laws are not stones to throw at people's lives. So figure out how you can put these ideals out there, but also walk with people. This idea of the field hospital that Christina mentioned is so important. He wants the parish to be that, especially around issues of marriage and family and homosexuality. Right? Something that came through in the surveys was not that all Catholics in the world had the same view on that subject. They don't. Global South is very much at odds with the U.S. and Europe on that issue. But consistently, people said that we need to figure out a way to welcome people, not to exclude people. How can we be the field house? There's good evidence that, in fact, the church does not serve as a field house. That is, for instance, that our Protestant churches do far better in welcoming people who have divorced, who have difficult family situations, but people who divorce are much more likely to leave when they're Catholic because they don't feel that there's any longer a place for them, and Pope Francis wants that to change. Now, some of this he has mandated. There are some reforms in the annulment process that are kicking in right away. And he repeats several times in the document that people who are divorced are not excommunicated, right? Wants them to know that they are still welcome, they are children of God, they have gifts that they can share with our community, etc. And he does this while also balancing concern for children of divorce who also can bear wounds. So in all of this accompaniment, there is respect and valuing for persons where they are. and a sense that the appropriate thing is to leave the details of how to do that to the local communities. Finally, he offers in this document an outward-facing vision. In fact, we don't have much of a romantic theology of marriage in the Christian tradition. The culture is way more romantic. The marriage liturgy is really not very romantic. That's why people need to bring things like unity candles. I don't know how many of these things you have. Unity stands, extra music, extra readings, because our liturgy just doesn't talk about those things very well. And that's because it's about something more. It's about the two, but it's about something much more. So that's why, although Francis spends a lot of time talking about love, he also asks couples not to just stare into each other's eyes, right? But to look beyond themselves and walk hand in hand toward others. Because they, like everyone else in the church, the single people, the divorced people, the widowed people, all the people, are disciples first. Marriage is just one specification of that. It's one way of being Christian. So he says families shouldn't see themselves as a refuge from society. They should go forth from their homes in a spirit of solidarity with others. And that way they become a hub for integrating persons. He also quotes, this is one of the things he does that's so radical for popes. Normally, they just quote each other. Okay? Quote other popes. Okay? Pope Francis doesn't do that. He quotes regular people, not sometimes people who aren't even priests. And one thing he quotes in this document is a poem by a South American poet, Benedetti. And it goes like this: "Your hands are my caress, the harmony that fills my days. I love you because your hands work for justice. If I love you, it's because you're my love, my companion, my all. And on the street, side by side, we are much more than just two." It's beautiful, evocative language. There's not much detail. That's okay. He's leaving it to us. We get to figure that part out. I think that Francis is not off the mark in linking love and justice this way. If you think about the gospel, not only is there not much romance, there's not much family. I was writing an article recently for a magazine and trying to think how many married couples are there. Besides Mary and Joseph, think about the shepherds and the wise men and the prodigal son's father and the widow who searches for the lost coin, and all these people I kept thinking, and the Jairus and his daughter, yes. Yeah, all these stories, they're all single. They're all single. Isn't that interesting? And think about the tables, the meals in the gospel. There are none where we have a father and a mother and children, turkey. That's another vision, right? That's Norman Rockwell for those of us in the US. I think you find more of that vision in the Mormon church, where family really is center. But if you look at our gospel, if you look at the meals in the gospel, it's a very different kind of table. This is a table where Jesus is the head, right? And the people there are a great variety of seekers and disciples and sinners and outsiders, and they're all there. And we know, right, that Jesus was called out by people at his time for eating with sinners. So if we want to think about the table, right, the meal, the family meal, I think it makes sense to think about that, because it's the church that is called family in the Gospels. That's why they call each other brother and sisters. So it's the people from all walks of life listening, being formed as disciples by the Master who walks in the ways of love and justice so that they can go and do likewise. That's the vision that Francis wants to communicate, that love and justice, inclusivity, diversity, fidelity, all of that belongs together. Thanks for listening, and I look forward to our continuing conversation.
So we've got microphones, we've got 4 of them, so those of you up there don't have to go too far. So we have 2 here and 2 back there, and I'm going to let Julie manage the questions. So make your way down, ask what you'd like to ask, get some conversation going.
And I did avoid some of the controversial issues, and if you'd like to ask me about them, I'm more than happy to answer questions about them. All fair game.
Thank you for your lecture. I have to admit that I did not read the final report assembly, nor did I read whatever Pope Francis wrote after. Part of the reason is that I was quite disappointed in the first report, and even more so in, I think it was called the Lineamento, which was meant to be something like the discussion paper for the assembly last year. And so I ask a question, or maybe I make a comment about the assembly rather than about what you talked about. Because I think too, and you already referred to that an actual practice of every day, it is what the bishops and what the bishops tell the priests to do, which also written. I don't want to underestimate that, but I think that ultimately it comes down to the local level. With respect to that, I have a question. I thought the fundamental problem, and I want your comment, I thought the fundamental problem with the document, or with the was that from the beginning, there was absolutely no way that the church's official teaching on marriage and family, this position was reflected in the questions, and of course was reflected in the answers. So you did not get a true picture of what marriage and family was like. By the way, I'm a social psychologist. I'm a social scientist, and I have studied marriage and family. So that is one of the things I did not recognize in the document, the reality of marriage. Part of that, again, was the starting position was the magisterians, the magisterian cannot be each other. That surprised me for a number of reasons, but also because, and I think you were referring to that, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. I think there was very little on marriage and family, in the early history of the church. As a matter of fact, if I'm informed correctly, there was not a blessing of the marriage until the 10th of the 11th century. It didn't become a sacrament until the 12th or 13th century. So that puzzles me. Why, given that history, why was the magisterium entitled?
Thank you. I appreciate all that. So I could see how someone reading some of the documents would be disappointed. As a theologians are trained to read documents in a certain way, one of the things we look for is what's being said and what's not being said. And what's being said but not being said vehemently. So I think that it's very true that there were kept being assertions. No teachings are going to change. We're talking about pastoral solutions. Yes? And that, in fact, is true, although one might say that, and there's ongoing debate about this, but I think the best argument that I can see is that Francis did open the door for communion for those who have been divorced without an annulment and remarried. So I think that that is a change. He also did a couple other things, though. For instance, on contraception. Contraception was a huge focus in the pontificate of John Paul II. It continued in Benedict. It's been a central aspect of Catholic teaching on marriage and family. In fact, some people who read the document, The Joy of Love, too quickly, secular commentators said, oh, there's nothing in here on contraception, because I think they Google searched for contraception, and that isn't the word that's used. But there is a very brief restatement of the Church's teaching. But that's all there is, right? In this whole document, right? And so what that means, Francis is saying, I'm a loyal son of the Church, we are not going to change that teaching. Okay, but what he's not saying is what John Paul II said. So what John Paul II said was not only is this the teaching, but those couples who are using artificial contraception are in fact lying to their spouses with their bodies, degrading the act of sexuality, disrespect. I mean, the language is really strong. We're talking about two Christian people who are making love. I mean, that was his language. Not there, right? That is not there in Francis. Instead, he reserves his harshest condemnation for sexual and domestic violence. He said this over and over in the document, this is what disrespects the heart of Christian marriage. So did he change it? No, but in the Church, when we say it less, when we talk about it less, we're leaving it behind. Similarly with same-sex marriage. Now that's that's a different issue. Similarly, he repeats with quotes from what earlier documents said very briefly and moves on. He is not going to be a culture warrior. He is not going to make this the center of his pontificate. This whole document is about something else. Now, sometimes people say to me, well, he just changed the tone. You know, what does all this stuff really mean? I think it's crucially important what he's not saying, what he's not focusing on, and all the mercy and all the inclusiveness. And he's saying, let's focus over here, right? What are you going to do in those families? How are you going to love that person? How are you going to work for justice with your kids? And it seems to me that it's much easier for people who are divorced and remarried, who are in blended families, who are in single-parent families, who are using contraception, who are in same-sex marriages, to say, I can do that. I can do that, or I can try. So I think there are significant moves. Is it what many of us would want to hear? No, certainly not. Not the whole.
By a previous Synod of Bishops, 1971, when one of the opening statements was action on behalf of justice and the transformation of society appear to us constituent of Jesus' message. And it really, for the first time in my life, put justice at the center of Jesus' message. I used to think prayer was, and anyway, it's really led me on a justice journey. And in keeping with the university you work at, Jesuit University, Jim and Kathy McGinnis wrote a series of books on parenting for peace and justice,
Yes.
bringing together family and justice. My wife and I were the coordinator of that for Canada, and it's influenced our lives tremendously. And so for me, it was just pure joy to hear your emphasis of justice for all people, especially your partner within the families. It was a wonderful tying together of what my life has been working for justice, and with my 44-year marriage to my wife, who couldn't be here tonight, but I'm going to tell her. And so I just want to thank you. I'm a huge believer in Pope Francis's outreach of compassion to the most vulnerable. And to be honest, in reference to the last speaker, it does have to be implemented locally by the bishops. But we all know that the bishops for the last 30 years have been appointed in the JP2 and Benedict sense. And so this new focusing of Jesus' message to reach out as shepherds to the sheep, and therefore smell like the sheep and go where the sheep are, is a wonderful gift to us, I believe. And it's appreciated, I think, not only by Catholics, but many of my non-Catholic friends admire Francis's reach out, especially also regarding the environment. So more of a comment than a question.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, for those who don't know, Kathleen and James McGinnis in St. Louis started this Parenting for Peace and Justice network, and it was one of the things that attracted me to the university as well. And they inspired, along with also, I don't know if some of you may know a Jesuit philosopher at my university named John Kavanaugh used to write in America and wrote a book, Following Christ in a Consumer Society. And they influenced networks of like-minded people in St. Louis. But honestly, they felt somewhat alone. And actually, I wrote my dissertation in 1995 on, I tried to write a social ethic of the family. And I used books like the McGinnis, which were more popular books because that's all there was. And so now, and I tried to put that into a kind of more sophisticated theological form. But now we're seeing this at the higher levels. But I think people have been living it also in different kinds of communities for a very long time. I wanted to say a word about the bishops too. I didn't answer that well. It is true that this is one of those situations where liberal Catholics are like, we want the Pope to be authoritarian, right? Right, but he's not going to do that, and that's going to be difficult. And it is true that this round of bishops has been appointed. They're going to be around for a while. Now they're not getting the red hats, right? They're not being called to Rome to be cardinals right now. Clearly, Francis picked centrist cardinals. That will influence the church in years to come. And I hear from my Jesuit friends that the priests coming in, the scholastics coming in, are definitely more becoming Pope Francis guys. And I think that there's going to be a different kind of focus. There's something also that's just, I don't know if they are going to be able to resist the tide, because there is such a deep appeal to this message. And I've been struck by this too. First of all, broad appeal among Catholics, liberal and conservative, except on the very edges, right? And also, I mean, I've been on radio shows about Pope Francis, and half the people will call in to talk about how great Pope Francis is are atheists, right? Everybody, we love your Pope. Don't like your religion, that's weird, but your Pope, right? So there's something about this movement, I think, that's going to have to be implemented. Now, it is true that there's a conservative bishop, Chaput, who is in charge in the US of the implementation. I don't know who's in charge here. So this will have some effects. But there are also people meeting in parishes all over the place, and they're going to decide things like, what is our ministry to divorced Catholics? How do we take account of the fact that some of our kids are coming from same-sex couples to our parish religious education? How do we acknowledge that reality? What can we do? And so I think parish life is still possibly going to look differently. And this movement toward open disagreement, I think, can't be understated. So when I go to parishes and people say, well, we can't talk about that, and I think, well, the bishops were disagreeing with each other. Pope Francis said that was okay. What are you afraid of? Like, let's talk. I think this is the moment to talk and see what happens. So I know the bishops have power, but I'm optimistic that some things can happen. Am I not controversial enough? No.
Another question.
I don't. I know that's a rumor that would be the case, but I don't know any more than that. Yeah. That's right. You all have a history together. You know who asked the questions.
And there's quite a bit I'd like to say, but I'll keep it relatively brief. I've attended a couple of synods of bishops. I've seen the Catholic bishops in Canada go from left to right. And I have seen the international press comment on it. What's happened in Canada? And what happens in Canada is leadership. As an academic, I was around when Extraordinarily Ecclesiae was being written and debated. This is a document on Catholic universities. One of the things it says is Catholic universities must challenge social structures, accept the social structure of the church. And that's always bothered me. And I've been in situations where I've seen it challenged, and in Rome, and I've had a cardinal say, the reason that we don't challenge the church's social structure is the church is a mystery. Period. I mean, you'd like to see some practical results from some of the things that get said and done. I suspect hardly anybody knows that I think it was 1984, the bishops of Quebec apologized for helping to create stereotypes. What they concluded was, women are going to confession, and they've been beaten by their husbands. And the advice they were getting, first of all, was, well, what did you do? And they understood that the church has played a really negative role in developing proper marriages and social structures. And as someone, and I've published a book, by the way, marriage and sexuality and marriage in the Catholic tradition. And I'm skeptical, okay? And I think I have good reason to be skeptical, so enlighten me. Take away my skepticism.
So the question is, as I take it, a skepticism that a church that has moved far to the right and has been complicit in creating problem does not want to change. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm not going to tell you there's no reason for skepticism. Yeah, we don't like to say that we change. We like to say in our documents, as we have always said, right? Before saying something different, right? So I think, I mean, one of the things that I feel like it's the job of theologians to say, we have changed, right? Have changed. So as we heard earlier, right, our theology and practice of marriage has changed. Yeah, we did not have the liturgy that we have now. Right? We didn't have anything like it, right, until the Middle Ages. We didn't have precise rules about it, even until Trent. Right? Um, it has, and if anybody thinks that the biblical family, that would be a good idea, actually, look at the biblical families, right, is what we have now, or that there's something like there's that and the traditional family. Those aren't the same thing. And you can look at our teaching on men and women in marriage. It's changed. So when I show my students what was said in Casti Connubii in 1931, I mean, they actually misread, they misinterpret what the Pope says because they can't believe that this is in a Catholic document, right? But it says there's an order in the family, and the man is the head and the woman is the heart. And there should not be an unnatural equality. That would be a problem. And they say women who desire to work outside the home, right, are denying their dignity. They're coming down from their throne. It's not what we say anymore, right? So now we talk about equal dignity. Now we talk about mutuality. Now we say you're not her slave. She's not your slave. You're not her master, right? We say that we try to keep. John Paul II jumps through all kinds of hoops to say, yes, Ephesians 5 is good, and that there is submission. But really what he says is there's mutual submission of men and women to each other, which is not the way theologians have interpreted that text throughout Christian history. So it's part of what Christian theologians and ordinary Christians need to do is say, yes, we have changed, and we've changed even on issues of marriage and family. Or take sexuality. Read Augustine on sexuality, and then read John Paul II. I mean, Augustine would have thought John Paul II would be awful, right? All this joy and sex, that sex is holy, and a popular commentator like Christopher West, who riffs on John Paul II, I mean, sex is like Eucharist. I mean, no way would the early church have recognized that kind of thinking, right? So the positive view that we have of sexuality, even our teaching on contraception. I mean, earlier in the church's history, the teaching was not that you should be open to procreation, but that you should be intending procreation. And even then, Augustine, Aquinas, sex is still kind of sinful. Still. And then even when the rhythm method is proposed, all kinds of theologians are really worried about that. They don't think, now we think of NFP, that's like the really super virtuous people. No, when it came out at the time, people thought, well, wait a minute. You're not willing to accept God's will. What if you are selfish in the pursuit of pleasure? But then gradually NFP became the benchmark. If you're using that method and not artificial contraception, then that is abiding in God's will, but using the tools of science that God gave us to understand when women ovulate, how not to get pregnant. So I think you can look at all of these different things and say, there's been significant change. Don't like to talk about it. We never say, and now we're changing, right? But we do. And so that gives me hope, right? And it's something, it's a central part of every ethics class I teach, because I want my students to understand, it may look like it never changes. They may say they never change, but we do, and that means that we can change again. Thank God we changed on slavery. I'm not so sure about usury. very happy about gender and would like to see us change a little more. Now it's slow change. Slow. Yep. Yeah. So I hope that, I don't know that Francis is remembering those parts of John Paul II and carrying them forward. He's remembering other parts of him, and I hope that's how we'll move. He's remembering the social mission of the family. He's remembering other things and trying to move forward in that way. I don't want to underestimate the difficulty, particularly in certain areas of the world and of the country. But it also seems to me that this is a place where lay people can have enormous influence. In groups like Parenting for Peace and Justice, don't know what other groups that you have here, where people gather together in small communities and talk about how to live marriage and family. There's enormous potential for people to talk to each other. We had a group in our own parish, just parents gathering, a lot of wisdom shared in that group, a lot of life wisdom over the years, a lot of support, a lot of accompaniment, right? Those kinds of groups, I think, can be enormously influential, so that if somebody would hear from a priest something as awful as, "What did you do?" that the other people around say, that's wrong. Wrong. And I think that Francis invites people to own that responsibility. I think about my own students right now who are being formed on our campus, very concerned about issues of diversity, of inclusion, of violence, of assault. Their consciousness is so different. So different. Those are the same kids that are active in campus ministry. They're organizing Pride Week. They're doing all these same things together. They're going to be different. They're going to ask for a different church, or they might leave. Right? That's a possibility too. But I don't think. I think they're gonna take it in different directions. That's my hope. So I think, yeah, go ahead.
We have 4 grown sons, and it disturbs me to read the bulletins in the churches that they attend. And there's usually a section on marriage, and it defines the criteria that one of the couple has to live in the boundaries of the church for months to a year. I can't just remember them all, but these are churches where we have our cottage. These are churches where our children attend in Toronto. Very disinviting, so that if 2 young people have gone and lived away and they want to be married, there are such tremendous barriers to access to the sacrament that it's just astounding. And I've tried approaching, not with my real name, the priests in these parishes to draw to their attention how unwelcoming this ministry of marriage is. And they respond by saying, "I will not apologize. I can't manage to do what I'm doing now I couldn't possibly marry the children of the people that live in this parish if they want to come back to be married, for instance. So it really encourages young couples to cohabitate because they're not being welcomed to the sacrament. So they miss the grace, they miss the blessings that might help them be successful. I think it's sinful what that these statements are in these bulletins. And maybe we need to open the charism to other people. Maybe priests don't have to marry couples. And by the way, you have to be married in a church. So if you want to be married where God is on a mountainside or in a pasture, the bishops don't allow the priest to do that. And if the priest gets a dispensation from his bishop, the bishop in the place can counteract that. So you see, many non-Catholic couples get married anywhere, right? Interesting that the churches in Niagara-on-the-Lake, where nobody lives, but they all want to go and be married at the winery, those churches can marry people who don't live anywhere near there. Why? It just, but what worries me is that the young people miss the grace and the blessings that can come with the sacrament. And our generation cannot explain this, especially if it's a mixed marriage. Like, how do you explain that to someone that's not Catholic?
So I'm not familiar with why there would be that specific rule.
Well, they make all kinds of rules, you know, that if they are cohabitating, they have to live apart for a year. I think we do have some clergy in the audience. They could probably give some examples, but
Yeah.
yeah.
So it sounds to me like there are a lot of rules that are making it difficult for people who are cohabitating to enter into church communities, and they feel distant. And then we have a lot of rules about weddings, and we know also that weddings, along with baptisms, are decreasing. Church weddings are decreasing now, which is a big deal. Yeah. So what do we do about that? I mean, this is precisely the kind of local issue. These are not, huge high-level rules. A lot of these are local rules. So it seems to me that this is precisely what parishes are invited to rethink. These are more pastoral decisions. So it would seem to me that there is a mandate now coming from Francis with this document to say, now go and figure out how you cannot alienate the however what percentage of your young people who are going to cohabitate, and figure out how you can bring them back, because that's what he's consistently doing. So, and he used a theological concept. It was controversial. The word kind of dropped out, but the concept remains in his document, and that's gradualism. So this idea that people gradually can come to a deeper, fuller realization of a moral virtue or ideal. And his idea was, and this was very present in the synod. I'm sure it's his idea because it's in different places and it made it into the synod conversations. Is that's how you should approach people who are cohabitating. Instead of saying you're living in sin, can't come in, here's the rule. What's going on there? That's good. That's interesting. See that, and then invite them in and make it easier for them to ask for more. He does that consistently. One of my favorite passages or phrases that he consistently uses is this: is the weeds. He talks about the weeds. Like people always have flaws, imperfections, the weeds, but you can still find God there, right? And he's consistently going for that, and he's inviting pastors to do the same thing. So instead of saying you're living in sin, and you look at what the commitment is, and you see the love that's there, that's what he's inviting pastors to do. Like I think about when he was in between the US and Cuba, he was meeting with Castro, and he was asked, did you ask him about the persecution of the church in Cuba and all of this? And he said, no, we talked about how he went to a Jesuit school and how tough those Jesuits are and how we both have a concern about the environment. You know, I mean, it's like he's going to find the connection. He's not going to go with the judgment first, right? That's what he wants us to do. And if a parish is doing something else, I would say that they're not operating. I think we need to call this out. You're not operating in the spirit of Francis then. There have been some people who have tried to say this document is not authoritative. That's a no way. There's no way to make that argument, right? It's not an encyclical, it's an apostolic exhortation, very high level Vatican document. The Vatican itself, it says, yes, it is authoritative, right? There are some theologians who are signing statements saying, you know, maybe this isn't, you know, maybe we need to have Francis clarify things, which means fix things that he said. And, you know, Francis not clarifying anything, right? So those voices are being told, no, actually, this is the current teaching. This is where we are now. So I think that then the people who know that need to be, using it. Well, this is where it's good to be in a church with some authority. Maybe we don't want the total top-down authority, but we do have a sense of this is where we are now. Okay. Let's invite our parishes to act on this, because that's what we need to feel. What Francis feels, what I see you feel, what I feel is that I don't want to lose these people. I don't want them to miss out on what marriage is. It seems so easy. Yes. And to be honest, on the subject of women, I have a little harder time being positive about Francis. There is one statement particularly difficult for theologians, right, where he calls us, trying to be nice, the strawberries on the cake. No, don't want to be the strawberry on the cake. All right. But he has said that we want to encourage greater roles of women. I think there are people studying this. There are more women being appointed to various commissions. You know, I mean, when you looked at the synod, I mean, it's incredibly, it was an all-male space. I mean, down to the reporters and it was a problem. And it was particularly problematic. One thing that worried me was that there are so many wonderful women theologians, senior to me, who have been working on these issues their whole lives. Lisa Cahill at Boston College would be one. Margaret Farley at Yale, who were not consultants at the synod, the way that theologians would have been consultants if they were working on other issues. That's really painful. No women theologians. There were women who were wives who were invited with their husbands to speak about marriage, sort of from the ground level experience, but not women theologians. So yes, I do think it's crucial. Women will bring different perspectives and voices into the room, and if Francis can figure out a way without changing the rules, right, to get us into those conversations, that will be important. Yes. Well, there was some talk early on, could women be cardinals? Because you don't actually have to be a priest. Possibly. Certainly we can be theologians, which can be a certain amount of power. And the question is, what else can we be? Right. But yes, ultimately, that's a change that many of us would seek. And it's hard to imagine full justice without that change. You can have a seat. Pardon? You can have a seat. Check your call.
Using my authority, Julie. So I'm going to invite forward Erica Toffelmeyer, who's our campus ministry coordinator, to formally thank Julia on our behalf.
On behalf of all of us here, Dr. Julia, I'd really like to thank you for speaking with us. I think when you first started and said, normally we're speaking to two audiences of family and social justice, and I think that was something that I'd always sort of felt but had never heard articulated so clearly. And to know that Francis is working to bring those together, I think is so heartening. And to know that he is using the same moral framework to frame both of these things, I think is really, really wonderful to hear. And I think I especially appreciated your honesty and your honest dealing with the challenges of the church, and that Francis is clearly doing a lot of great things, but we still have a long way to go. But I think the main thing that I'm going to be taking away, along with reading his document, which I was afraid to read before now, is that you kept saying that he's made a big, he's really talked about how we need to have these discussions and arguing is okay. And you said that's who we are as the church. And I like to think that that's who we are. And I think that's kind of what you were saying too, is that it's not just the higher level church, that we're the church, and that we can be having these conversations and these dialogues as well. And so thank you for bringing that conversation to us and allowing us the opportunity to give our own input into that as well. So thank you very much.
So some announcements. It's like always, all these moments of feeling like I'm in church. We've got to do announcements before we can leave. So the first thing to say is to sign up in the atrium if you want to receive information about these lectures or any other lectures and events taking place at St. Jerome's. We do send out regular emails, so if you didn't get any or you want to get some about future events, then please sign up in the atrium to make sure that we get what you want. Every year, St. Jerome's University is pleased to be able to present a program of speakers to the community, and we're glad that we can make them available to you. We're able to do so because of the generosity of very many supporters and partners. If you too would like to support the lectures, then where you sign up is also, there are some donation envelopes there, and you can fill in your name and want to say thank you to all those who have given and any who continue to support our lectures. If you missed it on the way in, Dwyer will be selling some fair trade products made available to you by our Social Justice Committee. Christmas is not too far away, so you can start stocking up for that. And you would have also noticed that John is here from our local independent bookseller, Wordsworth Books. So there are lots of wonderful books out there to take a look at. Also on that table, Julie's book that just came out, Hope for Common Ground. So she has, we don't have the book here, but she's got some flyers, so you could always order that book. And then I want to tell you that the next lecture in Catholic Experience is going to take place on Friday, November 18th, and that is the correct date. So, David Mulroney, who is the president of the University of St. Michael's College in Toronto, is going to be with us to speak on the topic, Living with the Dragon. Mulroney has more than 30 years in Canada's public service, including time as ambassador to the People's Republic of China from the years 2009 to 2012. And so on November 18th, he's going to talk with us about how China's rise in the global reality is reverberating across our country. And think about how we can respond in ways that continue to promote our own prosperity, our security, and also our values. So he's going to bring to this topic the perspective of a Canadian public servant who very much, he talked with me about, who struggled to live his own faith in sometimes what he experienced as an unfriendly environment. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation. And so finally, I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. It's wonderful to see you again, the faces that have come back this year. I thank you for your help in spreading the word about our public lectures. I hope I'll see you in November. But for now, have a safe trip home. Grab yourself a cupcake to go. And until next time, good night.